Welcome to the Alaska Weather Show. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan, coming to you from the National Weather Service on this Saturday, May 27th, 2023, and we are now in the Memorial Day weekend. If you want additional weather information on top of what I provide in this broadcast, you can go to weather.gov. That is the National Weather Service's online presence. It'll bring you to a map of the continental U.S. with Alaska and Hawaii to the lower left. Point and click anywhere on this map. It'll pull up the forecast with any relevant watches, warnings, or advisories. On the map here in the continental U.S. of note, we have severe thunderstorm watches in areas of the northern and southern high plains, fire weather concerns with red flag warnings in Minnesota and poor air quality alerts there, and a couple of different flood watches, Montana into the Texas Panhandle. Here in Alaska, we continue to watch the river breakup situation and the springtime flooding. The upper Yukon River is showing some signs of maybe starting to level off and begin to slowly recede, but we still have flood warnings for Yukon and Stevens Village. Those could possibly be extended here longer into the weekend, but at least there's a lot of water that's working down through the system, so high water is going to be a problem, especially on the Yukon for the next couple of weeks. Further downstream, ice jam flood warning is in effect for the Yukon Delta at Imanak and Alakanut. And then we're going to get some rain and very cool temperatures over the holiday. Memorial Day is not looking to be a good one in the eastern Alaska range and 40-mile gold country. As much as 1 to 3 inches of rain could fall, with temperatures in the 40s and 50s. But there are some signs. Some of the computer forecast models are hinting at a warmer ridge of high pressure building up out of western Canada across the Panhandle and into the southeast and central mainland as we go from June 4th to the 8th. That could bring some considerably warmer temperatures to areas of the state here once we get past the first few days of June. Quick check of a couple of FAA webcams. Fort Yukon enjoying partly cloudy skies, one of the warmer locations, 62 degrees this afternoon. But the river level there remains still quite high with flooding, especially in the lowland areas. Mountain Village downstream in the lower Yukon River, they have flood advisories in effect there. In fact, flood advisories are in effect from Grayling and Anvik down through this area. Temperature, though, 45 this afternoon, so rather cool temperatures there as well. So here are the two flood warnings for snowmelt flooding, the Fort Yukon and Stevens Village. Whether or not those are extended, that's a possibility, especially there at Stevens Village. But water levels are going to remain high this whole weekend through the middle Yukon system. And then as we get down toward the lower Yukon, we have flood advisories from Grayling and Anvik all the way down through Marshall, Holy Cross, Mountain Village. And then at Imanak and Alakanuk, those two locations are under the gun, therefore, ice jam flooding, because there's still some ice down here in the river that could jam up and cause significant flooding. The rest of the state, water levels are high, so be careful if you're out recreating along any rivers or creeks. Good news is, well, with this weather pattern, cooler temperatures, cloud cover, areas of wetting from showers, the fire danger is not going to be all that high, and that's good news, because compared to last year, it was so dry at this time we were dealing with all kinds of fires. Not this year, though. And here we have moisture coming up out of the Gulf, another surge coming up from the North Pacific. We have a few areas of low pressure situated here over the southwest quadrant of the state. And this is what's going to provide more rain along the Gulf Coast in through the Panhandle. Eventually, some of that moisture, that's what's going to provide the heavier rainfall as we get up there into the southeast interior as we go through later this weekend, Sunday into Monday and early Tuesday. So late tonight, early Sunday morning, low pressure will be here over the western Gulf with the frontal band pushing in through the Panhandle. A few areas of low pressure, another one off the southwest coast. And then as we get into Sunday afternoon, that push of moisture will come up further north, and by the time we get into Memorial Day, we expect some heavier rain here around the 40-mile gold country and the eastern Alaska range. As I mentioned, 1 to 3 inches of rain could fall, so not very good for camping with temperatures in the 40s and 50s. Another cold front here coming out of eastern Russia, pushing in off the Chukchi could also keep cooler temperatures going along the west and northwest coast. So no real warm air to speak of coming up here through the rest of this month and early June. Temperatures overnight will be above freezing most areas with the exception of the northern Seward Peninsula along areas of the Arctic coast. And then on Sunday afternoon, warmest temperatures in through the middle upper Yukon Valley, few upper 60s. Otherwise, just some upper 40s to middle 50s south central and the Panhandle, so definitely cooler conditions. Monday morning lows, again, very similar. Could be a bit below freezing, a little colder there, 20s along the western Seward Peninsula, northwest Arctic coast. And temperatures on Monday, Memorial Day, will definitely be cooler across, especially south central and the eastern interior, where some areas may not get much out of the upper 40s to low 50s. And even along the Panhandle here with cloud cover and rain, you can see temperatures only in the lower to mid 50s. The extended temperature forecast as we go from June 2nd to the 6th, kind of transitioning out. Prior to that, the below normal temperatures will be centered over south central, so that'll begin to relax as we get past the first few days of June. And then that potential for this big upper ridge to build out of western Canada northwestward up over the Panhandle and then into the southeast and central interior. This could warm up a good chunk of the mainland, especially south central areas. And certainly the Panhandle could see some very warm to hot temperatures if that comes to pass between roughly June 4th and June 8th. So stay tuned to later forecasts. As far as precipitation goes, in early June, precipitation should average near or a bit below normal, especially in the southern Panhandle, but still maybe slightly above normal in through much of the mainland, especially centered around areas of the Seward Peninsula. But there is at least some hope we could get a little warmer weather here once we get past the first few days of June.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Here is your aviation weather. If you have a flight planned either Sunday or on Monday, main features will be low pressure over the western Gulf, slowly lifting into the northwestern Gulf just off of the Kenai as we go into early Monday. Widespread IFR conditions along the Gulf Coast in through much of the Panhandle, both inner channels and outer coast. Areas of Bristol Bay along the southwest coast all the way up through the Bering Strait and up into the Chukchi Sea, areas of the Central Brooks Range and areas of the North Slope also seeing IFR conditions. Sunday afternoon, we expect IFR conditions to at least improve a bit along sections of the outer Panhandle, but remain along the inner coastal mountains of the northeastern Gulf Coast and inner channels of the Panhandle. Interior, we'll see some scattered showers, maybe even isolated thunderstorms trying to pop up along the central and upper areas of the Yukon and Tanana valleys, 40-mile gold country, and then down across the Bering Strait, and especially in through the central and the lower portion of the Bering Sea, widespread IFR conditions. Those IFR conditions extensive Monday morning from areas of the Chukchi Sea along the Arctic northwest coast, Bering Strait, all along the southwestern coast, YK deltas into Bristol Bay, and then out over most of the central Bering Sea, the eastern and central and western Aleutians. IFR also continuing, especially intercoastal mountains of the northeastern Gulf and inner channels of the Panhandle. And then on Monday afternoon, we expect VFR conditions to return there across the middle upper Yukon Valley with limited IFR conditions in northern Panhandle. And once you get interior there of Yakutat area, and then down across portions of the Chukchi Sea, but still widespread along from the Bering Strait along the southwestern coast and then out over much of the middle Bering Sea and Aleutians. As far as past conditions are concerned, Anatuvik Pass will be MVFR becoming VFR by afternoon, and the MVFR to even IFR conditions will be further north as you fly up there through the North Slope early Sunday. Adigan Pass MVFR becoming VFR. Lake Clark and Merrill, we expect IFR conditions Sunday morning down there along the southwestern arm of the Alaska Range becoming MVFR. IFR conditions will also become MVFR early in the day there from Rainy Pass on up through Windy Pass As we go further east, generally MVFR conditions will prevail at Isabel Pass Sunday, and as we go further east of there, Montasta, generally MVFR conditions, especially the southern half and into the Copper River Valley. Further north, VFR conditions should prevail. And then Tanita, IFR conditions early giving way to MVFR. Same thing at Portage Pass. We expect IFR conditions in the early morning giving way to MVFR. And finally, the far northern Gulf Coast, or up into the northern Panhandle, IFR conditions there at Chilkoot and White. Freezing levels aloft, we have lower freezing levels and cool pool of air over the southeastern Bering Sea and up along areas of the northwest. Freezing levels bump up aloft 6,000 feet over the Panhandle to 8,000 feet at AKwx. And also behind me, we see freezing levels go 6,000 to 8,000 feet through the western half of the Aleutians. Greatest threat for considerable moderate icing will be along areas of the Gulf Coast, western Prince William Sound, and then along portions of the northeastern Gulf Coast and through much of the Panhandle above 8,000 feet to above 10,000 feet the south end, and also some areas of isolated icing along the southwest between 5,000 and 6,000 feet. Upper level jet stream winds are strongest, southwesterly flow 90 to 100 knots coming into the British Columbia coast, lower Panhandle from the southwest. Low circulation near Bristol Bay, that's at 30,000 feet. At 9,000 feet, 700 millibars, a broad belt of winds northwesterly across the eastern half of the Aleutians, and then westerly through the lower Gulf, North Pacific, coming in to the British Columbia and Panhandle coast. Speeds generally 35 to 45 knots with a peak of 55 knots there south of the eastern Aleutians. And then at 3,000 feet, another broad belt of westerly winds over the Gulf, 35 knots, as high as 45 knots south of the Alaska Peninsula out of the west-northwest, with a low circulation over Prince William Sound east of the Kenai. And the greatest threat for turbulence on Sunday will be from east side of Kodiak Island down along the Alaska Peninsula, extending out through the Aleutians. Surface to 3,000 feet western Aleutians, surface to 4,000 feet over the Alaska Peninsula, and surface to 6,000 feet up there in the northwestern corner of the Gulf.
When I first started working here in the early 90s, this is where the glacier was. I mean, where we're walking right now would have been a pile of gravel that had been pushed up by the glacier, and then we would have had 100 to 200 foot high cliffs of ice right here. And as you can see, that's changed quite a bit. And if you look at that in 2 dimensions, you can sort of see the terminus used to be here, now it's back there. That gives you one measure. What that kind of 2-dimensional look doesn't show is how much mass has been lost, that the glacier has just sort of deflated. These 200-foot cliffs of ice have disappeared and pulled back to this gentle sloping glacier you see now.
When I was working in Kenai Fjords National Park, I used the topographic maps to navigate where I was, and I realized that the mapping of the glaciers was really off. The glaciers had receded a lot. There were new rivers and lakes that were establishing where the ice used to be or should have been according to the maps. And so then I did a study on this and found out that we had a 5% loss of glacier ice mass in the Kenai Fjords area between 1950 and 1985. A big change.
You know, one of the most compelling things we do, though, to document glacier change is simply take photographs. We've had repeat photography projects here at the park. They may not give you the most accurate data in terms of how much mass or real specific measurements, but what they do give you is a visual representation that can't be argued with. I mean, it really requires no interpretation.
Understanding what's happening, understanding these processes, and possibly being able to predict what's going to happen in the future is the best that we can do, and that requires science and research.
There's considerable research on climate change in Alaska. The most significant, I would say right now, is the Natural Resources Inventory and Monitoring Program, which is looking at change across a wide variety of vital signs or indicators.
Kenai Fjords National Park is actually a pretty good representation of what's going on globally with regards to glacier ice retreat. There have been studies showing that mountain glaciers are retreating all over the planet. There are probably well over 90% of the glaciers are in retreat status. There are a few that are advancing, and some are holding, their terminus point. But at Kenai Fjords, the tidewater glaciers are retreating more dramatically, but even the land-based glaciers in the terminus positions are retreating. It's pretty common for all the mountain glaciers. The big mountain glaciers in Wrangell St. Elias National Park, they're mostly in retreat too. We're really entering an interesting phase where what we call the cryosphere, the ice on the planet, is melting.
You know, in the more immediate past, it's clear that since the Pleistocene, glaciers have been retreating. So the idea that glaciers retreat is is no revelation. They've been retreating from across North America for the last 10,000 years. What appears to have changed and what has people's attention is the rate at which they're retreating. In the case of Exit Glacier, we have scientists who've been looking at it. We have evidence that the glaciers left behind, where we can track that retreat for about the last 200 years. And we can say with confidence that in the last decade, that rate has increased.
Terminus mapping is a great way to map a small portion of the ice field. We come out twice a year and we use a GPS to walk the edge of the terminus and map the farthest extent of Exit Glacier. And that allows us to see what type of changes are occurring over the winter accumulation period and the summer ablation period. With that data, that can help us as we witness these changes within the ice field, we can hopefully be able to correlate that with the weather data that we have.
When you look at an ice field that's 750 square miles, when you look at a glacier that towers hundreds of feet high, you get a sense of permanence. You think these things are massive, they're somehow a permanent sort of feature, and yet in a very short period of time, in a matter of a couple of decades, we've seen dramatic change in those things.
At Exit Glacier, we have a time-lapse camera set up on the glacier that allows us to take a couple photos every single day, and then to put that sequence of photos into a video where we can see changes of the glacier and the vegetation phenology throughout an entire year.
Virtually all the glaciers in Alaska are receding. Some glaciers are moving forward. That's not an indication that they're actually growing in size. It's just the rate at which they're slipping down the mountain.
In some cases, some of these glaciers are receding back up onto land, and so they're producing less ice. When you change the glacier systems, you're changing habitat for marine mammals and other wildlife. And the populations of harbor seals have dropped dramatically in the fjords. In 1980, shortly after the establishment of the park, in Island Bay, we had maybe 1,500 harbor seals. Nowadays, it's a few hundred.
In Arctic environments, much of the sunlight that reaches the Earth bounces back because it hits snow and reflects off into space, or ice on the ocean and reflects off into space. That's the albedo effect. When the snow thaws and instead you have rock or vegetation, or when the ice thaws and you have transparent ocean, the sunlight will convert to other wavelengths. It'll convert essentially to warmth. That does not bounce back into the atmosphere as much. So consequently, you get a warming of the ocean, you get a warming of the ground, you get a thawing of frozen soils or permafrost, you get a more rapid thawing of sea ice. So once the ice and once the snow is off of the surface, the rate of warming increases considerably.
If you're driving out to Exit Glacier, you'll actually start to see signs along the side of the road that have dates on them. Visitors sometimes are confused. They think they're elevations or something until they get up to the glacier and realize, oh, those were all date signs along the road that were telling me when the glacier was there. Another thing that's been happening in the Exit Glacier area in recent years is this flooding that comes at a time we're not used to. We're used to having maybe some flooding in the fall when we have a lot of heavy rain. This has suddenly been some flooding that's coming in the middle of the summer, usually not associated with precipitation events. It's associated with warmer weather and melting. when you walk down one of our trails that leads to Exit Glacier, there are a number of ways to get out there, but what used to be the main route is no longer really the main route because of the way the glacier has changed. So this main route to the glacier used to provide dramatic views of the glacier as you walk towards it. In fact, there was a large kiosk built at the end of this trail for people to stop and rest and enjoy the view of the glacier. Now, if they stop and rest at this kiosk, people think, why did the park put a kiosk here? Because it looks out at some shrubs. There's no glacier within view anymore.
The way we solve big problems like this is not all at once. There's a thing called the Sokolov's wedges, and you just take a little bite of the pie, one sliver at a time. So we try to do incremental changes.
When we talk to people about our concerns about climate change, about the changes that are happening to the glacier, we also want to leave them with some idea of what we're doing to mitigate some of the effects of climate change. For example, here at the park, as we retire vehicles out of our fleet, we try to replace them with electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles. We've done things like at the Exit Glacier Nature Center, helping to sort of experiment and install a cutting-edge fuel cell as opposed to running some traditional power source out there that relies on some sort of more greenhouse-producing gas.
My main hope for the future is that people get the message that the planet is changing fairly rapidly in places, particularly places like Kenai Fjords National Park, and that it is, we think, there's good evidence it's a result of atmospheric changes which are measured in terms of human inputs into the atmosphere.
The rapid rate at which these glaciers are changing now offers us the opportunity to talk about this place as a way of looking into the future. In a lot of parts of the country, climate change issues are a little more subtle. And we can point here and say, look how fast this is changing. This is what the future holds for perhaps a lot of us and a lot of the planet as climate continues to change.
I'm optimistic that people and nature will adapt to change, but my expectation is that change will occur. Time will tell.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back, and we'll start our marine weather segment with the sea ice. Well, the pack ice out here in the central northern portions of the Bering Sea continues to gradually melt off and break up further. We still have some areas of shore-fast ice along Norton Sound and areas further north as well. And it's been a slow process to melt this off because temperatures have remained cooler than normal along the west coast. We are seeing openings get a little more expansive here now along areas of the Chukchi Sea coastline, and especially along the east side there of Russia. Still ice in place across much of the far northern Arctic coast, Utqiagvik eastward through Kaktovik. But as we'd expect, temperatures will continue to slowly warm as we head into June, so that should further facilitate the melting and breaking up of the ice. Now, looking at the southeastern panhandle, winds will be southeast 15 to 20 knots, Stephen Passage down through Ketchikan, waves 3-4 feet. South winds 20 knots, 4-foot waves, Lynn Canal. For the outer coast, southwest winds 15 to 20 knots, waves generally running 9-10 feet. And on Monday, look for southeast winds across the inner channels, 15 to 20 knots, waves generally a few feet or so. As we get out to the outer coast within 15 nautical miles of shore, we have winds that are going to be southwest, south, turning more southeast to easterly once you get outside of Yakutat Bay, and waves generally in the 9 to maybe as high as 11 feet south of Sitka and off of Craig. Northwestern Gulf, there is a low pressure circulation in this region. We have easterly winds, Prince William Sound 20 knots, waves 4 feet. Winds on the backside circulating north and then northwesterly, and as high as 25 knots from the west there as we get out there toward the entrance of Cook Inlet with waves around 5 feet. For Monday, there's generally kind of a trough or area that just lies here along the northwestern Gulf, very weak low pressure. Winds out of the east 10 knots in Prince William Sound, but winds more southerly up from Anchor Point on up toward the north end of Cook Inlet at 15 knots, but westerly winds at the lower end south of Homer and again northeast of Kodiak Island, and we expect winds there 15 knots and 3-foot waves. Across Kodiak Island and the Alaska Peninsula, look for west to southwest winds 20 knots, as high as 25 to 30 knots either side of Cold Bay and Falls Pass. Waves 5 to 7 feet on the North Pacific side, building to 9 feet south of Falls Pass, 6 to 7 feet Bristol Bay, north of Perryville, but you get out toward north of Cold Bay, 10-foot waves. And then on Monday, winds should generally be out of the west around 20 knots, waves 4 feet Shelikof Strait, 3 to 5 feet on the North Pacific side, and 5 to 7 feet on the Bering side from Bristol Bay to north of Cold Bay. The Aleutians will see winds westerly, eastern Aleutians 25 to near 30 knots, becoming more southwesterly 20 to 25 knots west of Adak, waves 7 to 9 feet North Pacific side, and as high as 7 to 11 feet central and eastern Aleutians. And then across much of the Aleutian chain on Monday, winds will generally be westerly 15 to 20 knots, waves 6 to 7 feet on the North Pacific side and 5 to 7 feet on the Bering side. Along areas of the southwest coast, variable winds 10 knots within Kuskokwim Bay, southwest winds 15 knots into Bristol Bay, and west winds St. Paul 9-foot waves. Winds fall off to the northwest to north 15 to 20 knots from Norton Sound to St. Matthew, with waves of 2 to as high as 5 feet in the vicinity of St. Matthew. On Monday, winds will generally have a westerly component around 20 knots. The lower Yukon Delta south through St. Paul and including Kuskokwim and Bristol Bays, with waves 4 to 6 feet, highest waves out toward St. Matthew and St. Paul. Southwest winds 20 knots in the Norton Sound. And then across the far north, look for easterly winds as high as 30 knots in the vicinity of Kaktovik. Otherwise, winds turn westerly south of Point Lay in the lower Chukchi Sea 10 to 15 knots, and northerly 15 knots on the north side of St. Lawrence. And looking ahead to Monday, winds will be a bit variable. East becoming southerly by Utqiagvik 5 to 15 knots, and then winds more southerly through the lower Chukchi Sea up to 20 knots. And those southerly winds, south to southwest winds of 15 to 20 knots, will continue south of the Bering Strait, especially on the north side of St. Lawrence, and then on up in to areas of Norton Sound.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.